Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. As you might guess from the title of this video, we're going to be talking a little bit about the punk genres of speculative fiction. The premier punk genre is probably steampunk, followed very closely by cyberpunk. Which of these is more impactful on the whole is a bit of a debate. Aesthetically, I think it's steampunk, but thematically, it's undoubtedly cyberpunk. However, what's important for our discussion today is neither the aesthetics nor the theme. It is, as you might guess, the punk. Now, in general, it's hard to pin down exactly what a punk is. The classical definition means something along the lines of lowbrow or low class, or generally just of low quality. In its most archaic uses, it seems to have referred to prostitutes, but by the 1800s, it seems to have just meant crummy. Not very good. In modern parlance, it's connected with the punk movement in music, which is defined by being very DIY, anti-establishment, and doing whatever it wants. Now, you may have heard all this and wondered, what does this have to do with what I'm seeing right now? What does it have to do with the missing punk? Well, what you're seeing here is a solar punk cityscape. And as you might guess, solar punk is the missing punk I wanted to talk about. This discussion is brought about by a discussion I saw on one of the writers' forums I'm a part of, where somebody asked why there weren't a great number of solar punk stories in the modern day and age. Cyberpunk, steampunk, and to a lesser extent diesel punk or atom punk if you prefer, have made a pretty decent impact on modern pop culture. It's possible to find at least a few examples of each one in the broader mainstream. Cyberpunk Edgerunners has the punk right there in the name. Will Smith's Wild Wild West is a pretty good example of mainstream steampunk, and while a bit old or a little obscure, both Flash Gordon and The Rocketeer kind of represent that diesel or atom punk feel of the future. And as you work your way down into less mainstream things like books and comics, you see plenty of representations for each of these three subgenres. You could make some arguments about something like The Rocketeer being more general retrofuturism than a specifically punk story, but I would say the protagonist, especially in some of his comic incarnations, does have a lot of that DIY mentality, even if he's not particularly anti-establishment, so clearly that one is an arguable point. Anyway, the point is, each of these three subgenres is in some way embodying something of the punk mentality. Steampunk and atom punk often emphasize the individual against a larger, smothering society or scientific establishment. They have brilliant inventor individuals challenging the social and economic conventions of their day. While we don't really think of the 1950s or the Victorian era as a time of very lowbrow people, this is actually what gives the punk genre a chance to shine. Iconoclasts can be created in these societies that rage against whatever the standards of the day are in a way that speaks to the audience. And when I say the standards of the day, I don't necessarily mean the standards of the 1950s or the Victorian era. Steampunk and diesel punk generally use these eras as a vehicle to bake in whatever issue they want to make commentary on. The point is not so much the historical era or commentary on it, as it is having a time when things are pretty good that the creator can then rail against. Not to tip my hand too far, but it really feels like that is an integral part of the punk genre. And it's not an accident that it really came into its own in the late 70s through the 90s. You know, a time when the cultures creating punk literature or punk music were pretty economically well off, pretty stable, a good place for somebody to rail against it. I think the parallels are pretty obvious and easy to pick up on if you do a little research. What's interesting is cyberpunk as sort of the black sheep of the triad. Cyberpunk is about people in a very dystopian, unstable society where times are pretty tough for most people, and the punks are railing against the society that has kind of wrapped them up in a bunch of obligations and contracts and technological innovations they can't escape from. It's not a time of great geniuses challenging the prevailing structures through their brilliance and innovation. It's a time of all-consuming corporations that crush the individual under a heavy hand. the society is less stable and provides less of a platform to rage against it from. But the point of these stories is to create a recognizable structure, usually of an economic or social variety, to rage against. While cyberpunk doesn't harken back to any existing structure, it did and does play heavily on recognizable structures that are not always pleasant to work with, namely the corporate structure and the battle between corporations, as seen at the turn of the 20th century, or even before among some of the robber barons, and admittedly as seen today between some of the major tech corporations. So, with all this said, what is solarpunk? Why don't we see any of it? Well, solarpunk is a story about societies that are sustainable, quote unquote. I put quotes around it because sustainability is really kind of an amorphous concept. More on that in a second. Basically, the idea was to write stories about cultures that are in balance with nature, that don't take more than they need, that use solar and wind power to sustain themselves rather than the quote-unquote dirty forms of energy we get from fossil fuels. And the reason I think we don't see solar punk stories is because these kind of societies just don't fit the punk subgenre. Now again, kind of like The Rocketeer, you could make an argument that these societies would have some element of DIY to them because it is kind of about homesteading. You know, you build enough structures to power what you use and nothing more. So, like The Rocketeer mentioned previously, there is maybe a touch of that punk sensibility to it. The problem is that these are stories about basically environmental utopias. They're supposed to be perfect societies. There's nothing there to rage against. Even if there was, this kind of society is so alien to most people's modern experiences, it's not relatable. You don't have a strong social convention or a strong economic convention that people recognize and can sympathize with the protagonists in. And I'm not really familiar with a great deal of the solar punk work. Most of it is fairly old, published before the 1990s with a handful of exceptions, but what I've read in summary seems to indicate that for the most part, these are stories about utopias, not dystopias, utopias. That's very not punk. But the biggest problem is that, well, the whole point of punk storytelling, and indeed a great deal of speculative storytelling, is to take a modern issue and put it in a new context so you can explore it with fresh eyes. As I said before, much of the steampunk and diesel punk, or atom punk if you prefer, much of what I've read from those subgenres isn't really concerned with the historical period. They're just using it as a framing device for whatever social issue they wish to talk about. I don't really have a problem with that, by the way. You can do it well, you can do it poorly. But especially with steampunk that has a heavy dose of fantasy laced into it, I think you can do it pretty easily without causing real problems. But the point of punk is to be anti-establishment. You can't take quote-unquote sustainability, solar power, wind power, the rejection of fossil fuels, and tell an anti-establishment story about it, because the modern-day establishment loves all of those things. The solar and the punk are like matter and antimatter. Attempting to put those two things together into a story just annihilates them. The purpose of punk is to be anti-establishment. You cannot tell a punk story promoting the establishment. It's just not possible. So that's why I consider solar punk to really be the missing punk, because the solar part belongs to the man, and the punk doesn't want anything the man has touched. Now, the punk could want sustainability for its own sake. Unfortunately, sustainability has kind of just become a buzzword. It doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's just a way to say, hey, I'm a good person. It's a kind of virtue signal, because we all know that solar panels are probably worse for the environment than fossil fuels are, if you look at them as a whole. Between the space they take up and all the chemicals that go into making them, and the fact that once you're done with them, they become toxic waste, basically. It's a bit of a mess. So rather than try and reclaim sustainability, the punk will just do what he's always done, point at the man and call him a hypocrite. And that would be really meaningful if it weren't for the fact that the people who established the field of punk are now the establishment. The culture of the 80s and 90s is now what people look back on with nostalgia, what they are hearkening back to as a better time. The punk is now the man, and it's kind of uncomfortable for a lot of them. There's a lot of interesting ideas there that really are outside the scope of this discussion, because what I really find fascinating about solar punk and the revolving wheel of the punk and the man is that it pretty much encapsulates the story circle. And if you're not paying attention to it, it's very easy to get caught up in this kind of trap. Yes, sir, this discussion is going a little bit farther than just an analysis of the punk subgenres. You see, when the snake devours its own tail, eventually it devours itself entirely. The story circle, as I've said before, is the iteration on a story as it passes from one generation to the next. I tell a story to you, you hear that story and repeat it to someone else. Your repetition changes it slightly to match your own experiences and how you remember the story, not necessarily what I said, and so on and so forth down the generations. But a problem creeps up when the story becomes too self-referential, when it becomes entirely about itself and not about anything else around it. I think we see this in media a lot in the modern day and age. People who sit down to tell a story get caught up in the elements of that story as if they were some kind of platonic ideal. They can only talk about character archetypes as if they were an archetype. Superman as the paragon, Batman as the Avenger, and so forth. The same thing happens to genres. Cyberpunk as the dystopia ruled by the corporation. As if there weren't other aspects to the early parts of cyberpunk that were very useful in the discussion. I think that's essentially what happened to solarpunk. The early works got very caught up in this utopian vision, and they lost their very punky DIY anti-establishment nature, which put them at war with themselves thematically. They were never able to salvage any part of it because the genre ossified into itself to its own detriment. It couldn't look outside of itself and see the contradictions that were creeping up in that very utopian vision. They couldn't rage against their own sense of what was good for the environment. Every story circle runs the risk of spiraling like this. Instead of continuing in an unbroken circle with every iteration, it shrinks just a little bit until it is worn down to a shadow of what it once was. Portal fiction has gone through this cycle in the last 20 or 30 years. It's transformed from a subgenre about people going to fantastical worlds to learn things about themselves, to bring back knowledge to the world they left. A subgenre where anything can happen in literally any kind of world, to a very narrow parochial vision of another world where people basically live out video game fantasies over and over again. Rarely, if ever, do they confront any part of themselves at all, or bring back wisdom beyond a handful of so-called cheat skills. The story circle can be in an unbroken lineage of stories going back to the dawn of time, shared from one person to the next, slowly growing as it absorbs changes in cultures and growth in the human experience. But in order to do that, the people who tell stories must look beyond their own story. And I don't just mean they have to experience stories in other genres or anything like that. They have to get out into the real world. They have to meet with people. They have to experience the way actual life plays out. Not through the pages of a book or through talking to other people, but in their own lives. If you get sucked into a life that is just about story, then your narrative will never grow as you refine it. You will only slowly strip out parts until you have basically nothing left, a shadow, a parody of what once was. I think over time that's what happened to the punk subgenres. I think it's why we don't see solar punk anymore. The people who once created it got too caught up in being quote-unquote punk, and they lost sight of opportunities they might have had to expand the genre, to build it up into something a little more in line with the kind of biting commentary other punk subgenres were up to. Fortunately, I don't think the subgenre is dead. While I'm not a big enthusiast for the punk subculture, in fact, I found it a little bit pompous and self-satisfied even in the 90s, I fully recognize that a spiral that is spiraled in can also spiral back out. That's one of the strengths of the story circle, after all. But it's probably better and healthier to try and avoid that spiral inwards to begin with. So, hopefully, our brief meditation on the history of the punk genre and the unlamented death of solar punk will help us do just that. And let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.